Hello, everyone, and we are now in week 7 of 1 Year Bible as we're reading through. This last week we finished up with Exodus and some of the laws, the 10 Commandments. God rewrote the 10 Commandments on the tablets for Moses, and then the description of the tabernacle, and then we went into Leviticus, which also builds on all the different laws that God was giving to his people. And then we finished up in Matthew and moved into Mark as well. So moving to 2 different books, as well as continuing reading in Psalms and Proverbs. A lot of continuing about the wisdom of God in Proverbs, and just fantastic verses in there. Some of the Psalms were amazing that we read this week. One that always speaks to me, Psalm 37, I don't know, I just find that one is good when I'm going through a tough time and you feel like, oh, God has forgotten me. It's a good psalm to read. 2 things that I thought was interesting that tied together from the Old Testament to the New Testament this week was the tabernacle. As we're talking about building the tabernacle, it was God's presence among his people. And he wanted a place to dwell with his people. So he had the Ark of the Covenant built and the tabernacle. And there was what was called the Holy of Holies, was where they placed the Ark of the Covenant, where the priest could go in there once a year to be in the presence of God. And so that was the only time they were allowed to go, and it was only the high priest who was allowed to go into the presence of God once a year. And then in Matthew, just at the moment of the crucifixion, when Jesus died, that curtain in the modern temple that they had rebuilt when they established in Jerusalem, that curtain was torn in two. That curtain that divided the Holy of Holies from the rest of the temple. And that curtain was 60 feet high and about 3.5 to 4 inches thick. And it tore the moment Christ died from the top to the bottom. So we see in the Old Testament here that God wants to dwell with his people, but he dwells within the Holy of Holies and only allowed to see him once in a while. But when Christ died, that curtain was torn, and that temple where God dwelled is opened up so everyone can have God in them. And God no longer dwells just in that temple, but he dwells in our hearts and in our lives. So I thought that was really cool that we read about both of those things this week. But also another thing that really stood out to me, and I just want to read a little bit about what I journaled. Exodus 34, 6-7, when God describes himself to Moses, and he passed by him, and he said he could only see his back when he was up on the mountain. And this is what God says. He says, Yahweh, the Lord, the God of compassion and mercy, I am slow to anger and filled with unfailing love and faithfulness. I lavish unfailing love to thousands of generations. I forgive rebellion and sin. This is God's description of himself, like incredible how good he is. And all his description of himself is not I'm powerful, I'm in charge and all that stuff, but he's compassionate, he's mercy, he's slow to anger, unfailing love. Another thing too, I don't know if you notice as we're reading through the Psalms, God often is described as his unfailing love. And just a beautiful description. Twice it says here, unfailing love and faithfulness. But then if you read a little later, we read on February 16th in Mark, Jesus, he says, moved with compassion. Jesus reached out and touched him. I am willing, he said. This is where Jesus healing the leper, and to touch a leper was absolutely forbidden by the law, where you weren't allowed to touch anybody with any kind of skin disease. But Jesus moved with compassion. And isn't that interesting? Because the first word he used to describe himself in Exodus was compassion. You know, God is a God of compassion and incredible compassion. The fact that he sent Jesus Christ to die on the cross so that we could be with him shows his incredible compassion that he wants to have on us. And he sees our lostness, he sees our brokenness, and he understands how bad we are and how much we fail, yet he loves us and reaches out to us. And I thought that's a beautiful description of God, his compassion, and yet we see it lived out in Jesus. Not only does God say he's compassionate, but he came to earth and he showed his compassion to not just to the leopard, but to so many people when Jesus walked the earth. And I ask myself, how often do I show compassion? How often am I thinking of other people? How often do I, think less of myself and think of others more than myself? And it's a good challenge for us to be compassionate people, and not just to the people around us, but people overseas, the hungry, the needy. Our compassion can be shown by giving. It can be shown by acts of mercy. It can also be shown through prayer. There's lots of ways we can show compassion. So I just want to encourage you this week, and keep on reading, and I will share some more with you in a week. God bless.